Welcome to episode 182 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to be talking with Katrina Onstad, author of The Weekend Effect, about the history of the weekend and why your time off is essential and worth fighting for. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript, or find our new Truth for Teachers podcast community on Facebook. You can share your thoughts on the show there and reflect with other listeners in our private group. This episode is sponsored by ViewSonic Education. They're the creator of ViewBoard, an interactive whiteboard for the classroom, and My ViewBoard, which is the corresponding digital whiteboarding app. Together, these tools help teachers create engaging lessons from anywhere and present them in the classroom. You can search the internet, open your favorite apps, and play educational videos, all from your digital whiteboard. To learn more, visit viewsonic.com/education. So my guest today is Katrina Onstad. She is a writer whose first nonfiction book is called The Weekend Effect: The Life-Changing Benefits of Taking Time Off and Challenging the Cult of Overwork. Now, if you know me at all, you can imagine that title just jumped off the shelf at me when I was at the book fair, and I knew I had to read it. I made it probably to page 4 before emailing her and saying, I would love to have you come on my show. I was so excited to read this book, I couldn't even get through the whole thing without reaching out to her. I was already formulating questions for her in my mind about how to apply her work specifically to teachers. And she's a great guest to do that with because she's married to a teacher and she has lots of relatives who are teachers. So she knows what the workload is like. So I'm so happy that Katrina is here to share all of her research and her fascinating insight into the history of the weekend and the history of the 40-hour work week. And she explains how technology has actually sent us backwards in workers' rights. So we're going to talk about the history, and then we're going to talk about practical steps that you can take and also things that you should avoid doing if you want to make your weekends truly rejuvenating. Listen in. So at the start of your book, you mention one of my favorite quotes from the Downton Abbey series, which is when the Dowager Countess says, "Weekend? What is a weekend?" And you make the case that really just over 100 years ago, weekends were not a thing in many Western cultures. There was a ruling class who led a life of leisure every day of the week. And then there was a working class who never had 2 days off in a row. So I'm wondering if you can tell us about the history of the weekend.
Yeah, I love that quote too, the Dowager Countess and her shock at the, concept that the people who work for her might get 2 full days off in a row. And really, that wasn't that long ago, right? That's just the beginning of the 20th century when she's posing that question, which gives you a sense of how new this idea of a weekend really is. But of course, the original scaffolding of the weekend is really ancient, right? The idea of taking time off in a work week has its roots in religion. It's something that exists in Judaism, Christianity, in a different form in Islam. Really, what the weekend is anchored in is the Sabbath, the sanctity of the Sabbath, right? This old edict from the Old Testament that God wants, believers to take 1 day a week off of work, and to take that time, that's sacred time, to congregate with one another, to pray, to reflect, to be reminded that there is a life outside of work, outside of, the impulse to be productive. The Pharaoh was having the slaves, move these bricks around endlessly. And it was, God said, no, they have to have some time off to come to me. And of course that it was the original idea of Sunday, right? That we would not be working, would not be engaged in consumption or production or materialism, but it would be a true break from that kind of work spend cycle. But this idea of the weekend, we don't actually hear that until about 1870. That's the first recorded use of the word weekend. It came out of England. It actually arose, through a combination of a century and a half of fighting from organized labor And then there was this one group in London called the Metropolitan Early Closing Association. And they were a Christian organization of shopkeepers who were working 18-hour days during this time in the late
Mm.
1800s. And they wanted to push back against those really long days, but they also really wanted more attendance at church. And they thought if they closed early on Saturday, then people would actually have time on Saturday to have a little more fun before they were, in the church pews on Sunday. So it was a bit of a seat filler originally, the idea of the weekend. And from that, it began this slow evolution into the 2 full days, which has become a norm really in most industrial societies in some form, or at least an ideal that people strive for and people have fought for centuries.
It really didn't occur to me until I was reading your book that people have actually given their lives for us to have the opportunity for better work-life balance or to have this time off from work, that there were actually protests and demonstrations and all sorts of things for many years to prevent low-paid workers from being exploited. And I remember reading about the rallying cry in your book, which was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will.
Yeah.
And that was really eye-opening for me. I wonder if you can tell us about the struggle for workers' rights.
Yeah, I mean that phrase, that 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what you will. That was a song. It was on many banners. You can see the imagery around that slogan for better part of 100 years actually. So it's really interesting. Like our relationship to time as workers was really different when we were primarily agrarian, right? It was,
Mhm.
the seasons and the sun that dictated the hours with which people worked. And that included breaks during the day when it was too hot, or the seasons would change how people worked. But once industrialization really kicked in, there was this vast new workforce that was beholden to the clock, to man-made dictates of time. And people were indoors working in factories. And of course, this was unregulated, unfettered, brand new form of capitalism. And the first unions rose up out of that, these crazy 12, 14, 20-hour work days that were literally killing people, right? The conditions were so unhealthy. In the 18th century, the first labor strikes were about shortening the workday to a fresh 10 hours a day, right?
Wow.
From a 14-hour day down to 10 hours, and then gradually this 8-hour a day plea that you were talking about. And uh, the seminal moment of this long, century and a half long fight was probably May 1st, 1886 in Chicago, the Haymarket Affair, which is when thousands and thousands of people marched for this 8-hour workday. And of course, it ended in a terrible loss of life. A bomb exploded. We still don't really know what happened. Anarchists were involved. Police were killed. Protesters were killed. There was a high-profile trial in the wake of the Haymarket Affair. And really, sacrifices were made for workers to regain or to gain control over some of their time. And that 8-hour workday, of course, laid the foundation for just the thinking that people should actually have 2 full days, which gradually came in the mid to the late 1800s. Yeah.
So now we have this right to a weekend, this time of rest, which is protected by law to some extent, right? Like
Mhm.
well, let me let you expand on that before I continue with my question.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So you know what? I think I would probably speak too much to a Canadian context on that, because I'm not sure where things are standing in the United States right now about the 40-hour work week. But generally the 40-hour work week is what workers are guaranteed by law. But of course, that has really changed hand in hand with the erosion of organized labor, right? Like the unions are not as strong as they once were. And of course, protections for workers are not as strong as they once were. And that means very basic rights like overtime and weekends off. And what else is the other thing that's happened during this shift in worker protections is the rise of technology. And this is something that really hasn't been acknowledged for the most part, through legislation, which is that we kind of carry our offices in our pockets now, right? We are accessible 24/7. I'm married to a teacher, and I know that at night his email is exploding with queries from his colleagues and parents and students,
Hmm.
and that there is no off button. And this is, of course, a common experience across workers' lives today. And that work is largely uncompensated. It's not redeemed through extra time, and it's generally not redeemed through financial compensation. So, this is a huge issue, obviously, that feeds into burnout and exhaustion and physical and mental health problems across the working world. So we're in a kind of new zone of kind of unfettered. We're kind of back to almost the way that what I was talking about before at the beginning of industrialization, where all bets were off and workers were just expected to be on call 24/7. And the other part of that I think is interesting, and you may cut this out if you want, but that we have a relationship to work that's quite different. That's been described as a sort of form of Stockholm syndrome, where our
Mm,
identities are so tied to work that a lot of this 24/7 work ethos, we've really internalized that, and
yes.
there's a lot of status associated with being busy. There's been research done on what people regard as success, and one of the triggers, one of the things that people view as a badge of success, is people being too busy, being exhausted, and having overfilled time. And this is something that's actually kind of culturally revered, right? It's the optics of busyness. So people, I live in a big busy city in Toronto, and when you say to somebody, "Hi, how are you?" the first thing they'll say is busy. and
Yes.
or tired. And in a way,
Hmm.
it's a kind of one-upmanship, because if you're busy, it means you're valuable, and you're wanted and you're productive. And it's this bigger lens on who we are. Who we are as people is so related to who we are as workers. And that there's some that can be a great thing. We want to love our work. We should love our work, especially if you're working, I think, in a field like education, where love the work, I presumably, and there's such incredible, um, self value in it, and you can feel like you're actually making change, and those are great things. But on the other hand, it's work. Work is work, and if we don't protect ourselves from its infringement in every corner of our lives, we're not going to be very good at it.
There has to be a separation at some point. Like, you can't just be working 24/7. There has to be this dedicated time set aside where you can focus on other things in your life. And I totally agree that in our society right now, we're moving back away from that, particularly because of the technology, not just because of the technical work hours increasing, but just because we feel like we should be working all the time. We feel like it's making us more productive and therefore more valuable.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Although, the great lie of this is that working more doesn't actually make you more productive.
That's
In
right.
fact, countries that have shorter work hours cultures have greater levels of productivity. The United States is not a particularly productive culture, but it is a really long hours culture, which I think
Yes.
is so telling. And there comes a point, and research bears this out over and over, in a work week, where people are no longer doing their best work. That after around 40, sometimes 50, if that's an occasional, not a regular way of working, 40, 50 hours, whatever you're making is going to start being error filled. The
Mhm.
quality of what you're putting out there is going to weaken. So it's a bit of a lie, this idea that more work makes us better workers. It's actually not true. And which is why I think we have to, not only have institutional protections around healthy work-life balance and workout and regular work hours, but also for ourselves, we have to be really, really vigilant about protecting our own minds and bodies and relationships from the cult of overwork.
So let's talk about both of those things, and let's talk about the systemic shifts that we can be part of, and then also some things that individual educators can do to protect their time and make sure they're taking true breaks from work. So I know that your book, The Weekend Effect, is not about schools in particular, but
Mhm.
can you share some suggestions for how we can shift that do whatever it takes, work however many hours it takes mentality that so many educators have in our schools?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's actually really a hard question, particularly for people in public service sector
Hmm.
jobs like education, right? Because as you said, these are the purpose driven jobs. And so that's, your identity is doubly braided to the work, which is the wonderful thing about what teachers do. And also, I think the hardest thing about it. So not only are teachers going to be caught up in society's overall reverence for overwork, but the stakes are really high, right? If I don't do this extra work, a child's future is at stake, right? So there's this high burnout, exhaustion, and health risks. And so I really think when I'm asked this question, like, what can we do? I do feel like it's a lot to place on the workers individually. Overwork is a public interest issue. The first thing I always think of is this push for institutional change, right? Like worker protections. In France, they passed this really interesting legislation a couple of years ago called the Right to Disconnect Law for certain segments of public sector workers at agencies over a certain number of people. So it's not all across the board or anything, but basically it means that your boss can't contact you after 6 o'clock at night. And so it actually takes that burden off of the worker to regulate overwork, and puts it on the institution and normalizes healthy scheduling. So I think there's that. I think I think people who are paid better will work better. I think job
Mm,
sharing, creative management solutions, all of these things that are successful innovations from the private sector can work in the public sector. Um, but then the other question is, what can you do on an individual level, particularly as a teacher? um, I mean, take care of yourself. this is
mhm,
it is It's imperative, right? Like having leisure will make you a better teacher. It will make you a better person, a better human, right? When we have that time off, um, I think one of the most important things we can do is interrogate what we're going to do with that time, right? So one of the things I look at in this book is these categories of active versus passive leisure. And we know that often what people do when they finally do get that day off, if they're lucky enough to get it, is they're so tired that they kind of crash. And the two things that people do the most with their leisure are chores and consumption, like shopping, right? And so
mm,
these are kind of quick things that we have to do, of course, as people. We have to get that stuff done. Um, but a lot of that consumption or really passive, like sitting down and watching 8 hours of Netflix, or just that really vegetative kind of zombie like leisure time that we do because we're often so tired, doesn't rejuvenate us. Like it won't actually make you feel like you've had much of a break.
right.
But research shows that active leisure that kind of pushes us in ways we might not feel like doing at all, to engage with our own minds, to pursue hobbies. And actually, the number one thing that increases people's happiness and ergo their productivity, is connection to other people. Such a isolating thing to be working all the time, even I think in a school, which I know schools are so busy. But then at night, it's the marking and the planning. And you can feel, I think people end up feeling that they're not in touch with people in their lives who aren't part of their work lives. So having those connections outside of work, reminding ourselves to nurture those relationships that will bring value and excitement and creativity back into the classroom or into our workplace, I think is really important. So just making sure that that leisure uh, isn't so much about kind of checking out and distracting oneself as it is about enriching, uh, your mind, your body, your relationships.
I want to close out with a takeaway truth for something for teachers to remember in this week ahead. Is there something that you wish every teacher understood about the weekend effect?
I think that really looking at our weekends, like really stepping back and saying, okay, are these the weekends I want? I have so
Mm,
little time. So we all have so little free time. And I am always struggling to do this with myself as a freelancer who lives this kind of borderless work life
yes.
existence with work drifting into every corner. Um, how we live our weekends is how we live our lives. That would be my takeaway. And I think if we can bring some meaning and connection, um, you know revitalize ourselves in relation to our communities, people we love, and get engaged with activities that bring us joy, that we have some fun. Remember fun?
Mm.
That we are, planting a stake for ourselves and declaring that our time and our lives we're about more than work. And I think that will make everybody who walks into the classroom on Monday a better teacher. But my concern is always you'll be a better person. You'll feel better. You'll be a better human being. And I think that's what we all should be striving for. And it's what our students should be seeing too, and the people who love us. Yeah,
That's right. It makes you not just a better teacher, just a better person. Like what you do on your weekends and in your free time impacts how you show up in the classroom on Monday morning.
absolutely. Yeah, there's no line, right? I mean, especially in teaching, you're bringing yourself in there. So how is that self
Hmm.
doing? Have you been tending the self, or are you giving everything over? Are you drained? Is it work, work, work? So just a reminder that you matter as well.
You can get Katrina Onstad's book anywhere that books are sold. It's called The Weekend Effect: The Life-Changing Benefits of Taking Time Off and Challenging the Cult of Overwork. You can also search for Katrina Onstad on Twitter and connect with her there. Have a great week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it.